Hey everyone, here's Yoel, this is me. I'm here in my home in Jerusalem. It's sort of late night, but I'm here giving you the sermon for our service this week, which is still on Zoom. And today we're going to be talking about Job. Now, Job is an interesting book. And if you've ever been able to read through it all, it may seem confusing. It's very poetic, but I'm going to give you the general story. The general story is that God makes a decision to test Job. And Job, it feels like in an instant, loses family, loses possessions, and is left with nothing, and he is suffering. And most of the book are conversations between Job and his friends. His friends convinced that Job has sinned, and that's why he has brought this upon himself. And Job is saying, no, I didn't do anything wrong to receive this. And in his prayers and in his struggles, we find Job coming to God, demanding an audience, saying again and again, no, there will come the day and I will stand before God and God will tell me. God will explain this to me because I don't get it and I'm upset. And Job wants an explanation and he wants vindication because his friends have been accusing him of stuff that he hasn't done. So he wants explanation and vindication. And so as we go through this, we're going to be going through what God's response is. We're going to talk about the argument that God puts forth, the place that God is silent, and we're going to talk about the context in which God answers, a beautiful yet frightening storm that comes right at the end. But let's start off with the argument. Now, there has always been an argument, an atheistic argument, for as long as there has been history. And the argument is that there can't possibly be a good and all-powerful God. Why? Why? Because there is evil in the world. And if there is evil in the world, then either God isn't powerful enough to stop it, or he isn't good and therefore lets it happen. But an all-powerful, all-loving God couldn't possibly allow evil in the world. And that's the argument that's put forward. And it's there in the background. As we read through the book of Job, it's there saying, well, hang on a second, this guy hasn't done anything wrong, so God can't be good or God can't be powerful because this couldn't possibly be okay. And God comes with an answer that most people don't expect. But his answer is this to Job. Job's obviously expecting some kind of, justification or explanation. And God comes and he says, first of all, who are you? I mean, where were you when I was creating the world? Where were you when I made the heavens? Where were you when I wrapped the galaxies like they were babies? Where were you when all of this happened? You were nowhere, were you? He's basically coming. There's this great verse actually. So a great verse in chapter 38, verse 35. It's not part of our reading. But in chapter 38, verse 35, it says that the lightning comes to God, and when it's ready to go out, it comes to God and says, here we are. It's almost like the lightning bolts line up in a line and ask God for permission before they go out. And God is asking, so when the lightning bolts come and ask permission to go out, don't they ask you? Oh, no, they don't ask you? Oh, but I thought you were so smart. I thought you were the one that knew everything and understands everything, but you're not. So God uses this sort of a rhetorical sort of shutdown for Job, basically telling him, you don't know what's going on. You don't understand. You can't understand. It's like a 7-year-old coming and asking, well, how does the space shuttle get up to the space station? Isn't it too heavy? It's just, well, you could try and explain the physics, but basically you just want to say, sweetheart, don't worry, you'll understand when you grow up. You don't understand these things, Job. So shush. And what he's trying to, what God is doing, is putting forth an argument that is actually put forth today many times as well, which is, if an all-powerful, all-knowing God can cause these problems, brings these problems into the world, then surely we should be able to accept that he is all-knowing enough and deep enough and wise enough to have reasons for all the things that he does beyond our ability to understand. Basically, the reason that they are struggling, the reason that Job is struggling, the reason people struggle with evil in the world is because the God they have in their minds and in their hearts isn't really a God. He's small. He's tiny. In fact, it's almost like we come to God as something completely other. Now, I'm going to try and illustrate this for you now. I'm going to explain it. And I'm going to tell you the story of Elisabeth Elliot. Elisabeth Elliot is an author. She is a writer. She has been widowed twice in her life. And she wrote a book called No Graven Image. And it's about a linguist, a lady who studies languages. And she studies languages. She's very accomplished, but decides to abandon all of her accomplishments to go to the jungle, where she lives with a tribe that has no written language. And with this tribe, she begins to learn their language, which is only verbal, never written. And as she learns it, she begins to put it into writing and starts to write their language and to translate the Bible into their language so they can have the scriptures. And as she's doing this work, she's with this other guy who's a very accomplished linguist himself, speaks many languages. And one day she accidentally kills him. And she kills him by giving him an injection of penicillin, but the penicillin injection, it's not the right one. She gives him the injection and he dies. The tribe turns on her the minute that this happens. They take her notes, all of her little note cards, everything that she has, they throw it in the river, and everything that she has worked for is lost. And the book ends. And Elisabeth Elliot, after writing the story, released it, published it, and the Christian community turned on her. They said this was a terrible book, awful book. They didn't want to accept it. The story goes that there was even a head of a seminary, the head of a person who trains pastors, and he even told her that he blocked her book from receiving any awards or sort of praise in certain circles because, and this is the thing that people accused her of, they said, there's no way that God would be like that with one of his servants. And she shocked. Shocked. Why? Well, it's clear that nobody's understood the book of Job, for example. And the idea that all servants of God have everything just go right for them, that there are no tragedies in the kingdom of God, in this world, is silly. It's wrong. It's ridiculous. And when you look at her life, you realize that the story that she wrote wasn't just a story. It was the description of her real life. She really experienced these terrible things happening to her. And so how could they fall for this idea that this doesn't happen? Of course it happens. And brothers and sisters, I want you to understand this because this is something we need to understand before suffering comes into our lives. As a pastor, I can tell you, trying to understand these lessons when we're in the midst of suffering is very difficult. We need to learn it before suffering so that this can hold on to us during. And there's this line that the character, Elisabeth Elliot's character in the story, says after all this stuff has happened to her. And she says this: "Now in the clear light of day, I see that God, if he was merely my accomplice, he had betrayed me. If, on the other hand, he was God, he had freed me. God is God. If he is God, he is worthy of my worship and my service. I will find rest nowhere but in his will, and that will is infinitely, immeasurably, unspeakably beyond my largest notions of what he is up to. She is basically recognizing that God isn't her accomplice. He isn't her assistant. He isn't the one there that just blesses and gives so that she can go where she needs to go. That's not God's role. God is God. He is a God-sized God. And if we're struggling and if we're fighting, if we don't understand why these things are happening, it's because the God we see is the accomplice God, is the small God that's supposed to give me the things that I need. But that's not his role. He is God. And in his shadow do I stand, do I live. And when I see him like that, when I see the real God, then I can trust in him. And I can trust in a wisdom beyond my own. I can trust in a God more powerful than I can possibly fathom. And then I can find rest. I only find rest when I come to God-sized God and not a small God who I'm not too sure I can trust. That's the difference that Elisabeth Elliot was trying to communicate in her book. That was the truth she was trying to get across, and the truth that so many missed. Now let's come to what God didn't say in his argument. Now when we come for the explanation, when Job comes for an explanation, he doesn't understand what's going on, but we, the reader, do understand what's going on. Because at the very beginning of the book of Job, we see a scene where God is speaking to Satan. And God goes to Satan. He says, hey, look at Job. Look at my servant Job. Isn't he awesome? And Satan says, of course he's awesome, because you bless him. And Satan comes to him, it comes to God and says, if you take the blessings away, he wouldn't be faithful to you anymore. And God decides to make a fool of Satan and tells him to only take enough away from Job so that Satan can see that he is completely wrong, because God knows Job. And as Satan does this, Job's faithfulness, Job's love for God is shown clearly, is shown obviously. And now Job's name is used, has been used and still used throughout history as the image of someone who is patient, who is long-suffering, who is waiting, who is faithful. But God can't tell Job the reason why this is all happening. And so I want to explain why. Now, if you've seen the movie Amadeus, you'll have heard this story, but bear with me. There is a young boy by the name of Antonio Salieri. And Antonio Salieri is a good Christian boy, and he prays. And he prays as a young boy, and he asks God, will you make me a great composer? Will you make me a man of music, a great composer? And if you do this, he tells God, I will be chaste, I will not be with women. I will be chaste, I will be humble, I will work hard for the church, I will serve, I will be a great guy. And after his prayer, the boy does what he says. He serves, he cares, he loves, he does what he can for everybody around him, and never is always chaste, does not go with women. And God is fulfilling his side of the bargain. And he becomes a great composer. He becomes the court composer in the house of the emperor, the head of the Europe at that time. And that is his position. But then Salieri meets Mozart, and there's this scene in the film where Mozart comes in, hears a bit of Salieri's music, and then takes it and improves upon it and just makes Salieri sees that his talent is nothing. His gift is entirely overshadowed by the gift of Mozart. But it bothers him, it bugs him, it drives him crazy. Why? Because Mozart is a pig. Mozart sleeps with women. Mozart has no morals. Mozart is a fool. Mozart behaves in ways that drive Salieri crazy. And he doesn't understand. He is incensed. He doesn't understand why Mozart gets to behave horribly and has the gift that he has, but Salieri has to behave nicely and give up all the things that he doesn't do, and yet his gift is not as good as, it's not better than Mozart's. And it drives Salieri crazy to the point where he comes to God and he takes the crucifix, the cross on the wall where he prayed every day, and he grabs it and he throws it into the flames, and he turns to God and he says, you and I are enemies now. He turns his back on God, refuses. He cannot abide, and sort of does things. He ends up, by the way, killing Mozart, and does things to try and humiliate God and attack God, because that's the way he sees him. Salieri sees God as the accomplice. He sees God as the small God, the God who's supposed to give him things. And if he gives God and God doesn't give him, then God is unrighteous and God is thrown out. In Job 40 verse 8, God comes at Job with something like this. And he says, are you trying to justify yourself? Are you trying to work this out for yourself here? But Job doesn't throw his cross. I mean, not that he had a cross to throw, but he doesn't throw his cross. He doesn't go where Salieri went. Why? It's because Salieri thought that he could do things for God and put God in his debt. But Job knew that ultimately, even though he was righteous, even though he was blameless, even though he did all these great things, ultimately, his relationship with God was based on grace. His relationship with God is based on God's goodness, not on his own. And so he can't come at God with those kind of words. And he doesn't. So why does God not tell Job what's going on? Because if God had told Job what was happening, then Job would realize that this was just a test, that he just had to do it in order to get the rewards at the end. And God wouldn't do that to Job. He doesn't want to take Job's love for God away by turning it into a Job love for rewards. If we come to God for blessing, if we come to God for something else other than God, then we're missing the relationship. God wants to be loved for God. And we know that, we see that in our own lives, because all of us want to be loved for who we are. We don't want to be loved for what we can give you. I don't want to be loved for what I do for you. I want to be loved for me. And God wants to be loved for God. And if we love God for the blessings, then the blessings become idols. They become pseudo-deities in our lives. And God doesn't want to trouble Job's heart in that way, and by dangling rewards in front of him, as if it's the rewards that we should be after. We shouldn't. We should be after God for God. He should become the desire of our hearts, so that when we are finally with him, we have the desire of our hearts, because it's him. That's what God is trying to do for Job, and that's why he is silent about why it is all happening to him. And then finally, the storm. In Job 9, verse 17, Job, in one of his back and forths with his friends, he says, you know what, I'm afraid if God does show up, I'm afraid that it'll be in a storm and he'll crush me. And inevitably it is a storm, but not just any storm. I want you to understand the storm here described in the book of Job, it's like a hurricane storm. It's the whirlwind. This whirlwind starts whirling around Job. And obviously, it could be for him, his fears, all happening around him. But in the whirlwind, God refers to himself as Yahweh. He uses not Elohim, not the generic word which has been used throughout the book, but uses the term Yahweh. The reader is supposed to get an intimacy there, a love, a grace, hey, I've come to counsel you. I've come to get you out of the stupid place in your head. While at the same time, there's the context of this great storm, this whirlwind whirling around Job. And in this moment, and by the way, if you already see the comparison with our Matthew passage, with the gospel passage, which we'll read during the service of Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33, of the disciples in the boat, the wind is crashing, everything's going crazy, which is why these two passages are read the same week. In this whirlwind, you see God asking Job a question. And he asks him this question: must I be condemned that you be justified? Now, in the context of Job, it's a rhetorical question. The answer is obviously not. Obviously not. I'm not going to come out the bad guy so that you can come out the good guy in this thing. That's not how this works. It's another way of just telling Job to shut up. However, if you think about it, not in the micro of Job's story, but in the macro of the story of humanity, must I be condemned that you be justified? The answer is yes. The answer is obviously. Because there is a Salieri. There is a dark evil. There is a thing, an anger brewing in each one of us. And in order for God to transform our hearts, to change us from within, ultimately, He, the Son of God, has to come and take all the violence and all the anger on all the power, the waves, upon Himself, so that He can call us out to safety, so that we can walk on the waves as Peter walks in the gospel story, so that we can be free and we can know Him. And there at the end of the book of Job, Job finally turns to God and says, I don't need my explanation. I take back my request for an explanation, because now Job has done more than just know about God, but he has experienced Him. And now not only does he not need an explanation, but he knows that he will be vindicated, not by his righteousness, but by the righteousness of God. And so he can stand before anyone. We can stand before anyone, because our righteousness is not our own. It's not our actions that allow us to stand tall, but the actions of Christ. So brothers and sisters, if you are in trials, if you are suffering, if you are struggling as Job, or if you are angry like Salieri, come before God. Not a small God, but a God-sized God. And a God so massive, yet willing to suffer so much on your behalf. And before you ask for blessing, before you ask for good things in your life, remember that it's about you and Him. It's not about the blessings. Remember, it's about you and Him. Do you love Him for Him? Do you love God for God? Is it more than just the blessing that you have received? Is it more than what you can get out of the relationship? Because if we come to Him and more than just know about Him, but experience Him through baptism, through communion, then we will not fight, we will not struggle. We can rest in Him, knowing that He is there for us and with us. God bless you all.